Now, if you used Duolingo in the past and you haven't gotten great results out of it, I want you to know that it's partially not your fault. Now, I've had my Duolingo account since 2014, so we're talking over 10 years at this point. And throughout that time, I've used Duolingo on and off, depending on my motivation. And I was very frustrated for a while because I noticed that, my skills in in whatever language I was learning, whether it was like Spanish or French or whatever, like I was like learning some things, but I felt like I wasn't really reaching the levels that I wanted to reach through utilizing this app. So after like just kind of doing some research and doing my own introspection, I realized that the app Duolingo really isn't sufficient for learning a language in some pretty serious ways. So I wanted to put this video together and just explain to you like why you may not have had success with Duolingo and what you can do instead to really help to boost your results. So let's jump into this. Now, the first thing that you have to realize in regards to Duolingo is that Duolingo is ultimately just a collection of different courses across various different languages, like Spanish, French, Japanese, Portuguese, whatever, they have a ton of different languages. Now, it would be ideal if every single one of the languages got the same amount of tender love and care, and, the same amount of updates and features, what have you. But unfortunately, that's just not the case. Like if you went and tried like a few of the different courses that Duolingo offers, you probably realize that the quality of the courses do vary a lot. And ultimately, there's just a subsection of the courses on Duolingo that get updated on a fairly like regular basis. So you're talking about courses like the Spanish course, the French course. I believe like the English courses get updated pretty regularly, and and there's a couple of others as well. But they have like a ton of different courses. Like one of the courses in particular, Esperanto, like with that course, like they kind of updated like how they structure the course, but the content has been more or less the same. Like they don't have like any of the latest features that you'll see now in Duolingo, like being able to do like the video call and stuff. So a lot of these courses just aren't getting the same amount of attention just across them. Like some courses definitely get a lot more attention than the others, because one thing you have to realize is that Duolingo is ultimately a business at the end of the day. Like they need to make money, so they have to go to where the money is, and the money is going to be in their most popular courses. I know that may not be ideal, for some people, depending on what language you're learning, but it is what it is. Another thing too, yeah, because like some of these courses don't get updated, is like some of the information may be inaccurate and or it maybe just be outdated. So, that can really just help to deteriorate the experience of utilizing Duolingo, especially if you're trying to learn a specific course and it happens to be one of the courses that Duolingo doesn't put a lot of focus on. So that could definitely hurt your chances of really making a lot of success and just really progressing on your language learning journey. Last but not least, is that there's an insufficient practice of the core skills. So when I think about language, I like to think about it in terms of being able to write, speak, listen, and or read in your language to a sufficiently high level. Now, even with like some of their better courses, like the Spanish or the French course, I still feel like it's not quite as enough practice with the core skills. But this problem is even worse with the courses that they don't put a lot of focus on. So, if you're not doing a sufficient amount of like writing, speaking, listening, or reading in your target language, then it's going to be very difficult for you to attain a high level within your target language. Next thing, so this isn't really so much about the content of the course itself, but this is more so about the expectations that you have prior to utilizing Duolingo. And when you have unrealistic expectations and those expectations aren't met, it can be very distressful and just be very frustrating. One thing Duolingo says is that they claim to be the best way to learn a language. And this is true, I would say, to a certain extent. Duolingo has definitely gone above and beyond to make language almost like learning a video game. Like there's so many different gamification elements, like like the leaderboards and being able to compete with other players, and just like maintaining your streak. Like they do all this different stuff where you almost forget that you're learning a language and it feels like you're just playing like some game like on your phone. And I do think that it is effective to a certain extent as far as like getting you to like start learning a language, but after a while you're going to need to like let go of that whole like need for like things to be gamified. Like there's just going to be certain aspects about learning a language that really doesn't map on well to like a video game. Like there's certain things, there's certain skills, there's certain things you just have to do where like focusing more so like on the video game aspect, it could be more of a distraction and a hindrance to anything else. Another thing too about Duolingo is that they claim that they free and that they provide free language learning, to other people. And this is true to a certain extent as well. Like there is a free plan for Duolingo. You mean you can download it. It's true that you don't necessarily have to spend any money to utilize the course, but what you're going to realize is that when you're utilizing the free version of Duolingo, the experience isn't all that great. Like for starters, you got these ads that are constantly coming to you, like between lessons. I think there's like an energy system now. I'm not sure if they still have the heart system anymore, or I don't know. They was like fiddling around with that for a bit, but yeah, like because of that, like if you make a certain amount of mistakes, then you're not going to be able to progress them after a certain point. Like maybe you can like solve some puzzles or something to like to get some more hearts or energy, but I heard like they was like fiddling around with that. So basically when it comes to like the whole free version, like you're very limited as far as like what you can do with the app. So for me personally, like I have the super version of Duolingo, but they do have a few other paid plans where I'm able to get an unlimited number of hearts, so I can go and I can just practice as much as I want. I can make as many mistakes as I want without having to worry about like waiting like a certain amount of time before I can like start playing again. I don't have to like worry about seeing any ads. I can really just sort of get in the zone as I'm going and I'm utilizing the app. But of course, not everybody is in a position where they can get a paid plan. So if you're one of those people where you absolutely need the free plan because you can't afford the paid plan, then your experience just isn't going to be all that great. Another thing too is that they overstate the effectiveness of short daily lessons. Now, I do think it's good to have short lessons because at the very least it gets you moving in the right direction. But you can't really just learn a language by just doing it for like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes per day. I mean, technically you could, but your progress would be so slow. Like it could just border on frustrating. Like for me, I found to be the sweet spot as far as making a sufficient amount of progress each day is at least like 1 hour per day, like I'm learning your language, if not more. So doing like a few minutes here, a few minutes there, like it's better than doing nothing, of course, but it's not going to make a huge impact unless we're talking about like a very, very long time. But yeah, you should definitely try to like look beyond the whole short daily lesson, like look at it as a way for you to just kind of get moving in that direction, but try to scale up that time because the more time that you put into your language learning per day, generally speaking, all else being equal, the faster you're going to progress in your target language. Another thing too, in regards to the whole unrealistic expectations, is that there's very limited instruction of conversation as well as spontaneous speech. Now, Duolingo did come out with a feature fairly recently where you're able to video chat with like one of the Duolingo characters, and that's cool and all. But the thing is, like, it requires a paid subscription. So this is something that free people can use, and even though I have like a paid subscription, I have to get like the next level up from what I have right now in order to access the whole AI chatting thing. So it's a cool feature to have, and it does help you get sort of like that conversation practice, but you have to pay to experience it. So it has very it's, unless you have the money to like to put towards it, then you're not really going to benefit from it. And again, like I don't really have a lot of experience as far as like how those conversations and how that works because I never paid for it. But even then, talking with a robot versus talking with a person is going to be two entirely different experiences. Like sure, there could be some overlap. It can probably help you, just get in the habit of like forming words with your mouth and getting somewhat comfortable with the idea of talking with someone other than yourself. But if you really want to go and master language, then it really comes down to just speaking with like other real human beings. Like a robot has yet to get to the point where they can mimic other human beings. Like, of course, they're getting very good and they're probably going to get a lot much better, later on, throughout the years. But as of right now, like there's really nothing that replaces, speaking with actual human people. So moving on, another issue that can cause Duolingo not to work for you is the lack of grammar explanations. Now, this is arguably one of the few things I would say that traditional education at least got somewhat right as far as when it comes to teaching languages is the importance of utilizing the right grammar. I mean, I would say that they probably focus a little bit too much on that, but at least they understand that grammar is an important thing. And especially these days now, when you have people talk about like comprehensible input and you don't need to study grammar and stuff, I mean, I think that's just a bunch of nonsense. Like I think some grammar explanation, some grammar study can be very helpful as far as helping you to acquire the language. And this is something that Duolingo really just misses the mark on. Like some of the grammar tips that they provide, it's really basic. Like they give you like a few like little bit details here and there, but not enough to get like a really strong grasp of like the different grammar concepts. Also, again, you have to consider the fact that the grammar tips and the grammar instruction is going to vary a lot on depending on what language that you're learning. So languages that are not supported are going to have even lesser grammar explanations compared to languages that have more support. And also, it's not always very intuitive to figure out like where to find these different grammar tips and explanations and stuff. So, there's also the navigation issue. Another thing too, when it comes to Duolingo, like their general approach to grammar is that they try to focus more so on implicit understanding over explicit understanding. So implicit understanding, basically how that plays out in the app is that they give you a bunch of sentences, um, emphasizing different grammar points and different grammar structures and stuff. And you have to, figure out and you have to translate and you have to solve these things. And over time, you start to get a feel for what's the correct grammar for your target language. Now, I do think implicit understanding is very helpful because that's ultimately where you want to be at. Like, that's where native level speakers are at. Like, for me, like, I'm a native level English speaker. I'm able to go and use the grammar of English in a way where I don't have to think about like conjugation rules or anything like that. I just speaking and like it just all comes to me. So, yeah, obviously, that implicit understanding is important. But before you can get to that point, especially if you're someone that's still in the process of learning the language, it helps to be able to explicitly study the grammar points of the language so that way you can understand how it works. And then once you do some study and then you observe like seeing the different grammar as it plays out through like reading and like listening and like hearing people speak and stuff, like once you see it, once you combine the theory with the practical, that really was helps really helps to cement the grammar knowledge within you. And then it gets to that point where after you've just been exposed to it so many times that it becomes implicit and you just like know how to do it almost at the same level as a native speaker does. But I think Duolingo try to like rushes that process a bit. Like they give you like a little bit of grammar explanations, just like a little something for you to hold on. But for the most part, they try to focus on getting you to build that implicit understanding. But that by itself just is not sufficient. Like you definitely want to have a bit of both. Another thing too is that the context within Duolingo, especially within the different courses, is that it's very fragmented due to like drilling isolated sentences. Like I'm sure, I mean, we're all pretty familiar with like how Duolingo works. Like you get these bunch of different sentences that sometimes you have to translate from the target language to like your native language. Then maybe you have to translate from your native language to the target language. Depending on what exercise that you're doing. And you get all these different sentences, which is helpful and all, but grammar doesn't necessarily grammar works a certain way when you see it play out over like several sentences. Like when you look at like when you're reading like paragraphs of like text or when you're hearing people speak for like an extended period of time, like the grammar is going to change and evolve in like very subtle ways. And you kind of miss that context a bit when you're just looking at isolated sentences. So in that sense, also like the grammar instruction, the implicit instruction of grammar that Duolingo does really just isn't sufficient. So moving on, another big issue with Duolingo is that they don't really give a lot of exposure to the target language. So one thing you want to consider is that a lot of times when you have these different audios from the different courses on Duolingo, like it's not very realistic in the sense that like the audios are either like very clean, like it's very easy for you to like to listen and you can like hear all the words enunciated correctly. Another thing is that usually the audios are like fairly slow, so it's very easy even for like a beginner learner of the language, to be able to follow along. And this is probably like arguably the biggest sin, which is like sometimes the audios can be synthetic. I'm not a huge fan of utilizing synthetic audio to learn the sounds of your target language. Like if you could find people that are native speakers or native level speakers that are able to speak and enunciate, and you can really hear how it sounds from a real person, I don't think there's really any replacing in that. Like I know some of the courses do utilize some synthetic audios. Like I think some of the English courses and stuff like that, but yeah, that to me is definitely a big problem. Another thing too is that because Duolingo has like these pristine conditions for listening to the audio, it doesn't really prepare you for the real world where you're going to hear people that's going to like slur the speech or sometimes things aren't going to be said as clearly. Like people sometimes speak like pretty fast and stuff, and you have to like be able to like pick up what they're saying like in real times. You don't really get any of that with Duolingo. Like all of these are in very control, like all of the audios are in very controlled conditions, and that's not going to prepare you for the variety of different sounds that you're going to hear within the language. And of course, there's also accents as well. Like you may have one language and this different ways that people speak it depending on like the region and or the country. Like for instance, like I speak United States English, but there's also British English, there's Canadian English, there's Australian English, and so on and so forth. So just being able to learn and get used to one accent or one dialect doesn't necessarily prepare you for like a different accent or a different dialect. So these are all things that you have to consider. Another thing too, as far as the lack of exposure, is that there's a really narrow focus on high frequency words in Duolingo. Now, part of this is a bit more like practical. Like it would be impossible to have like a broad amount of words across a broad different number of subjects. Like in the app. Like the Apple, the courses will probably be like 10 times as long. If they try to include that many words. So I get like why there's a certain amount of practicality as far as like focusing on the high frequency words, but depending on like what domain that you're interested in, like maybe if you're interested in like in history, or maybe like philosophy, or you like art or what have you, there may be like a couple of words here and there that may help you learn the terminology of that different domain. But for the most part, you're going to have to look outside of Duolingo if you really want to build a type of vocabulary that's unique to whatever domain that you're trying to study. So that's something you have to consider as well. Like you may be able to have a general understanding about a wide variety of different things after utilizing Duolingo. And of course, this depends on the course that we're talking about here. But beyond that, what I mean, like when it comes to like really going deep within a particular subject or particular domain, then you may notice that you just don't have the right vocabulary to be able to understand and or express yourself within that particular domain. So, that is something you want to keep in mind. Not last but not least is that there's a very minimal cultural context. So one thing that I've realized when it comes to language is that language and culture are very intimately related with one another. Now, of course, language is not culture, but it's such a integral part of culture that they you can't really have one without the other. Like when we talk about like when I talk about myself being American and American culture, there's that culture is transmitted like through language. Like there are different words and idioms and different sayings that's very unique to American culture that is only expressed in English. And the same thing is true for like French. Like you have French culture, which is transmitted through the French language. You have Arabic culture that's translated to the Arabic language, and so on and so forth. So, because with the way that Duolingo is structured, you don't really get that same level of like cultural immersion that you would see like in the outside and in the real world. So it just doesn't really prepare you as well, as it could have, as it could. So there's that. So all that being said, I talked about Duolingo, how like why Duolingo doesn't really work, but what can we do, with all of this information? So I do have a few pieces of advice that I think may be helpful. One of the things is that I'm not saying that you necessarily have to stop utilizing Duolingo. Like if you enjoy utilizing Duolingo, you get a lot of value out of it. Like maybe it helps you just like get into the habit of like learning languages and just showing up every day. You appreciate like the whole streak function, like just being consistent with your language learning. Like I do think Duolingo does have a place, but all I'm saying is that if you're going to utilize Duolingo, don't utilize it as the only thing that you use to learn languages. Like see it as like one part of like a much bigger puzzle. Like pair it with other different apps, whether you like listening to podcasts, or you're watching videos on YouTube, or maybe using an app like Anki to learn vocabulary or what have you. Like I've actually made like a whole playlist about different apps that you can check out, and you can see like which one of those apps works best for you. But you really want to see Duolingo as just a part of a larger ecosystem of language learning apps and resources. Another thing too, when it comes to Duolingo, is that you don't want to spend more than 30 minutes to 1 hour per day on Duolingo. So like I said, Duolingo is a cool app, and you can definitely, get lost in like just playing and like going through the different exercises and stuff. But I feel you could be much more productive with your language learning outside of Duolingo. Like Duolingo definitely works really well as a supplement. So, like depending, like you may want to like, I do think it's worth it, like focusing like a certain amount of time on Duolingo, work through the lessons, going through the listening exercises, the reading exercise, the speaking exercise, just really just focusing in on it for like 30 minutes, 1 hour per day. You can get that value out of it, but then you can go on and, you can do other stuff. You can like do some reading, listening to podcasts, utilizing another app to like train a different like skill that you want to work on or what have you. So just like try to cap the amount of time that you utilize Duolingo, so that way you can go and you can do other things to benefit your language learning. Another thing too is I would highly recommend ignoring the gamification elements of Duolingo. So this is probably one of the biggest things that makes Duolingo so addictive. For so many people. You got the leagues. You got the friends quest. You got the diamond tournament. Like when you get to the diamond level, like they got all this different stuff, like all this different gamification stuff that really just kind of like sucks you in. So I would highly recommend like not getting involved in like a majority of that stuff. Actually, if you go into your settings in Duolingo, you can go and you can like turn off certain things. Like for instance, you can turn off the friends quest, so that way you don't like get any friend quests with people. You could actually set your profile to like the private, if you want to, just really like take it all the way. So yeah, like I say, just by ignoring the gamification elements and just focusing on completing the course, that's going to allow you to utilize your time the best. Like at the end of the day, the core of the learning that happens in Duolingo, it happens on like the learning path as they have it structured right now. So if you're just focusing on the learning path every day, just focusing on knocking out like a few lessons for like 10, 15, 20 minutes or however much of time that you spend per day, that's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck, so to speak. Like just progressing on that path ultimately to the point where you finish the course. And this leads me to the last thing in regards to what to do is that you want to leave Duolingo once you've gotten everything that you need out of it. Like Duolingo is a lot of fun. Like it's cool, like seeing the streak that you're able to build up over a certain amount of time. But once you get to the point where you finish a course, or maybe you're like 80, 90% of the course, but you've already felt that you've gotten everything that you needed out of the course, the best thing that you can do is just call it a day and just to move on. Now, if there's another course that you want to learn on Duolingo, by all means, focus on that course. Or maybe there isn't any other language that you would like to learn on Duolingo, or utilizing Duolingo. So in that case, like the best thing I would recommend doing, is just deleting the app from your phone and just moving on with your language learning journey. Like don't get yourself caught up in like the leagues and the streak and anything like that. Like once you got what you needed out of it, just cancel it. Just get rid of it, and just move on. That's what's going to that's I think that's the best advice I give you. Like don't feel like you have to keep using it after you've after everything is said and done. So, anyways, that's all I got for you today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. I also wrote a blog post on my website as well, where I talk about like how you can go about using Duolingo effectively. So I'm going to leave a link to that down below. So definitely feel free to check that out. If you want to learn more about how you can go about utilizing Duolingo effectively. So yeah, so this is Jacob Laguerre. I'm signing off, and I will catch you in the next video. Peace.